Mike, welcome to the Talent Development Hot Seat.
Andy, we finally made it.
Yeah, we finally did. You are in Melbourne, Australia, and of course I'm in Orlando, Florida. As we record this, it's 4 in the afternoon for me, which means it's 6 in the morning for you. And
Dark. It's dark outside.
it's dark outside. It's taken us a little while to get this scheduled and make it happen, but we finally did, and I appreciate you coming on and getting up so early in the morning.
It's a pleasure, Andy. I'm looking forward to it.
Cool. Well, I don't remember how I first came across your book, 7 Stories Every Salesperson Must Tell. I think I saw someone post about it on LinkedIn, and I went and grabbed a copy and I read it right through, and I really appreciated it. Especially, me being in sales, I'm working a lot with talent development professionals and looking for ways to partner with more companies. And I wanted to get better at storytelling. And so it was very helpful for me. And the reason why I invited you on the podcast, we talked before we got on, is that, most of the people listening to this podcast are not in sales. But I think many of them are looking for ways to get better at influencing, maybe at telling stories themselves. And I also hear requests more and more from people saying, I want to help my leaders get better at storytelling. Do you have anything to help them with that? And so even though I know your book is geared more towards salespeople, you've been in the corporate world for a long time, literally all over the world. You've worked in a lot of different places and have used stories in a lot of different situations. And I know it can be helpful for them. So before we dive into what some of those components are, maybe you can share a little bit of your background and how this book came about.
Absolutely. Yeah, happy to. Yeah, I grew up in Tasmania, which is a little island, not in Africa, but off the south part of Australia.
Right.
And I graduated as an electrical engineer and electrical mechanical engineer. And I got the dream job out of what you call college, we call university, which was to work, dream job if you like travel. It was to work on oil and gas drilling rigs in the jungle and out in the ocean in very remote situations. And my job was to run surveys in oil rigs and to fix the electronics if it broke down. And if we were working offshore, you'd have a drilling rig that stopped operating while you did the survey, and that cost $1 million a day. And if something doesn't work, you got to fix it, and you might be way out in the jungle. I worked in China and Indonesia and Malaysia, and then I went to Europe, and it was very exciting life early on. But I got into software development, actually running some of the very, very early artificial intelligence neural network applications on rock physics. And then I got this call to my boss's office one day, and I was working in London, and he said, Mike, we've got this great job for you. We want you to go to Norway. Yep, off to Norway, fantastic. And then we want you to be a salesperson. And I'll go, no, I don't think so. That is not what I want to do with my life.
Right.
That was 1996. What I said was, I can't go because my wife is 8 months pregnant. But that night she said, okay. And she flew on the last day that she was allowed to fly, actually 8 months pregnant. And
she wanted to move to Norway. I think that was, I remember hearing your story before. That was the persuasive thing.
Yeah, my wife is quite adventurous. But that was actually a pretty big move. She gave birth in a public hospital in Norway because there are no private hospitals, as far as I know. It's running a pretty strong socialist style of government there with 70% tax and everything provided. And I learned how to become a salesperson. And to be honest, I would have been straight back to engineering, to software engineering, if it wasn't for extreme good fortune. And one of the things that people probably don't appreciate, I think Australians are better than this than Americans, to be honest, is noticing when you've been really lucky and being a little bit thankful for it. I landed a huge deal, and it wasn't me, it was my client. I just got in the way of it in my rookie year as a salesperson. And that was what made me think I could be good. This is very common actually in selling. Buyers have to buy. And if you're lucky enough to get in front of a good deal,
I have been there.
You might just make the mistake of thinking you're good at this game.
Yes. 100%. I've been there.
Yeah, and it's actually one of the learning and development challenges with salespeople is, if you've had a little bit of success due to luck, you can make the wrong conclusion, as I did, which is that you're highly talented.
Right.
And I
Yeah,
surely wasn't.
by the way, I had that experience. My biggest client right now is an oil and gas company, and I met them because I went to a conference and happened to meet the right person at breakfast who connected me with
Yep.
the right person, and it was the timing was perfect. They were ready to do something, and I had a high off of that for a long time, thinking I'm really good at this game. And then it was a long time before I went and got another sale, and I'm like, oh, maybe I need to get better at this.
Yeah, we take the good and bad fortune, but recognize what is your ability and what's your skill and what isn't. In business development is tricky. Is really easy to be misled.
Mm,
More so, I think, than almost any other role in business. Maybe with the exception of the founding entrepreneur. It's really easy to be misled by good and bad fortune. And the reason I mention America is Americans don't really like to talk much about good and bad fortune. You know, there's this
mm,
sort of there's a belief system of grit and determination, and you'll overcome everything if that's all you do. And
right.
I think that it pays to learn how to step back a little bit and think, you know, compared to other situation, did I have good fortune or bad fortune, and what does that really mean for my development? But yeah, so I got into sales management, Andy, and I worked all throughout Europe. I ran a sales team in Moscow, in Russia, in the former Soviet Union, which was fabulous, really good fun. Not all that safe for my family. I had 3 boys by that stage, and I don't know if you remember, but in in the early 2000s, 2002, there was a siege in a theater in Moscow, and Chechen terrorists took over 850 people in the theater, and the barricades for that, the police set up, an army set up barricades around the theater, was directly outside our office in Moscow. And by then I've been living in Moscow a couple of years, and I had this sort of deep feeling in my stomach that this wasn't going to go well for those people in the theater, and didn't. More than 100 died from gas that was pumped into the theater. And I was thinking, look, you know, I've got my family living here, and yeah, this could be us. And at the same time, my dad wasn't very well back in Tasmania, so we decided to come home and to live in Melbourne, which we'd never lived in before. We had bought a house there. That was condition of going to Russia, was from my wife, was we have to buy a house before we go, and she went and bought the house. I went to Russia, so we had a place to live, but we didn't know anyone. And there's no oil and gas industry there. I was working on oil and gas software for Schlumberger. And so anyway, I told her, I know the story I told her. I told a very good story to get a job in telecommunications, working for Siemens, selling very big, you know, multi-tens, multi-$100 million equipment to the biggest telco in Australia. And I was supremely unqualified for that job in every aspect. I didn't know anything about my product, my company, or my customer. All the things that they say in the job ad that you must know, I didn't know any of those things. But I was lucky again, really. But I did tell, I know I did tell a good sales story of selling myself to get that job. And I went on to run sales teams then in telecoms, went back overseas, got headhunted back to Australia into a totally different industry, which was facility services. But by that stage, I had contacts, I had people I knew, so that wasn't so difficult. But I sold facility services in the mining and oil and gas camps in Western Australia, which are massive deals. We're talking about tens of thousands of people in villages and towns. I don't know if you know, but Australia is being dug up and sold to China at the moment at an incredible rate.
Right.
And so I did that. Then I went back into telecoms, and eventually I decided to start consulting. And the reason was I had this career mostly managing salespeople, more than 20 years, and a pretty continual frustration that how to get salespeople to say the right thing in their sales conversations. And I didn't really know how to teach that. I just knew that there was this massive need, because most people who are given the job of selling, whether they're called business development or whatever, or sales, they kind of struggle along, not quite ever doing a brilliant job. It's one of those areas where maybe only 15-20% of any sales team is really performing well. And it's not really understood why. And that fascinated me. And I incorporated storytelling early on, but my experiences of teaching anything other than storytelling, which were a total failure with sales teams, led me to just focus on it. And then I wrote 7 stories last year, well, starting early the previous year, and really with the idea that, I've finally found something that really works with salespeople. They just love to learn about storytelling. I've got to get it in a book, or I never get the ideas out there. So that's why I wrote about storytelling, but I've used storytelling all through my career, pretty unconsciously to start off with, then much, much more purposefully as I get into it.
Yeah, no doubt. And you've had so many experiences. I remember reading in the book, and so many places where you've been able to use stories to help sales along and win big deals, even when they looked like they weren't going to be winnable with these huge companies, huge deals, and working across different countries, different cultures. Why are stories so compelling and so important in business?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And when you write a book, Andy, and you have to commit what you think to paper, it's a really good intellectual exercise. You have to do the work. And so what you do is you read all the other books on storytelling in business and sales, and what you read is not very satisfactory, not to an engineer. I'm an electrical engineer. I need to know how things work in detail. And the traditional, if I was to paraphrase the traditional answer to that question, it's something along the line. There's always a sort of a pseudo neuroscience answer, and the answer is something like stories connect with our emotional brain, or our emotional centers, and they allow, through the telling of the story, the listener to experience some emotion, which is how you make decisions first, and you need to appeal to emotion. It's not a satisfactory answer because it's not really how our brains work. If you really want to understand how our mind works in a business context, you need to understand that the governing organ is the neocortex. The neocortex is the big part of your brain. It's 75% by volume, and it's a massive wrinkled sheet of nerve cells. If you were to hold two fists in front of you like that, it's in two halves. It's wrinkly like your two fists, but if you were to lay it out flat, it's about the size of a large dinner napkin, tea towel we would call them in Australia or the UK. And it's about 2 or 3 millimeters thick, and is about 30 billion neurons in 6 layers. And it's not the fact that there's neurons, it's these 6 layers that really matter. And there's neurons all through your body. People talk about the brain in your gut and the brain in other parts of your body, but it's the structure of the neurons in the neocortex that is doing something very special. What it's doing is predicting what's going to happen next. And your neocortex was predicting that I was going to say the word next, and that your ears were going to hear the word next. And what the neocortex is doing was something that our artificial intelligence systems today cannot yet do, but they will, is continuously predict in real time everything you're going to see, hear, smell, touch, and feel internally. And that feel internally is the real key to understanding stories as well. So when we talk about emotions, it's not the amygdala, it's not your heartbeat, it's not your churning guts. It's those things acting just like a sense. You can think of your guts like a sense, like your eyeball is, your eyes are a sense. You can think of that as a sense of your internal state being sent to the neocortex. And the neocortex is analyzing all of those sensory input and predicting what's going to happen next. So when you're having a business conversation, you're actually predicting, how will this person feel next? And how will I feel when I say something? And what will I see when I say that? And what will I hear? And what will I smell? So we're continuously predicting. And at the lowest level, the cortex is just predicting very mundane things. It's predicting little patterns of light into points and lines and shapes. But then it's hierarchical, and then it builds up, and then faces, and then concepts. So it's predicting those things, and it's predicting what's going to happen next. And the highest level, the highest order of a sequence to predict is a story, because the stories are complex sequences which we try to predict what's going to happen next. And by cultural convention, stories are hard to predict what's going to happen. So in fact, Stories are so fundamental to being actually a mammal because they're about predicting what's going to happen next. And when you understand that our mind is a memory sequence prediction organ, you'll see patterns and sequences to predict everywhere. You'll hear them in a song. You'll switch the radio on in your car and you'll be able to predict the next note of the song, if you know it, within 3 beats. I count them. Bang, 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 that song by that artist. And I listened to it when I first heard it in that situation. Prediction. You're just predicting it. You'll notice it on an image. Some of the most interesting works of abstract art put things in the wrong place. So what's happening when you look at a face is your eye is jumping from place to place several times a second, 5 to 10 times a second. It's called a saccade. And so you look to the eye and the brain predicts the other eye is going to be over there, and that predicts the mouth's going to be down there, and the face is there, and it's slowly recognizing what to predict. Whose face is that? And we do the same when we look at art, and our eye is dancing over in a prediction. And the artist's fantastic at foiling that, at surprising us in what to predict in a piece of work. In fact, that's a good definition for a fantastic piece of art. It's something that teaches us a new way to predict what's going to happen in the artwork. So we're doing it with every sense, all the time, real time. And whenever we can easily predict, we stop predicting and we just run our internal program. So our daydreams and our ruminations are just internal auto predictions. So whenever you've lost people in a meeting, whenever you're trying to give a presentation and they're lost, it's because they could now easily predict what you're going to say next, or they thought they could, and they've switched off because they don't need to. We don't need to put a lot of mental energy into predicting something that's easy to predict. We just stop. It's the reason that we are accused of not listening well by our partners, because we think we know what if you run standard patterns of conversation every time you come home each night, you're going to become predictable and you're going to stop listening. And I am the world's worst listener, according to my partner, and she's not that great either. Unless we recognize this fact, right, and start to have more interesting conversations by
good stories are unpredictable, is basically what you're saying.
That is the fact.
What comes to mind to me, just to break this up, is that you go to a movie, right, and you're captivated when it's a really great story. And if it's not, sometimes you come out and you hear people say, well, that was so predictable. And they're disappointed because the story was so
correct. Yeah, that's exactly right. We have our neocortex is seeking out interesting, unpredictable things, and it's doing it all the time. And everyone has one. Every single human has a neocortex. There's no one that doesn't have one. And they're all seeking out interesting, unpredictable things. So that includes the CFOs and the CEOs of major corporations. So people sometimes ask me, can you tell a story to anyone? And does everyone like stories? And I say, yeah, everyone's got a neocortex. Otherwise, they're definitely not a CEO or a CFO, or a CFO of a big company. And they will respond to stories as long as you're not wasting their time. And that's the critical thing about business storytelling, is we need to make a business point with a business story. And that's probably one of the key ways that people fail with storytelling, is that they're not tight. They're not making a business point. And we're really talking in a business context about small anecdotes. I mean, I've been rambling on. I wouldn't do that in a first meeting with a CEO. I would definitely be much tighter. 2 minutes is a good time to aim for these anecdotes.
Yeah, so there's got to be a business point, and I think that was a question that was in my mind that I think came up in your book, where you had sort of like a frequently asked questions near the end, and one of them is, and I've learned this working with different people, and even I've run training on social styles and working styles. Everybody has different working styles, right? And I've talked about it on the podcast before. I'm very social, so I like to hear people's stories and tell people's stories. But my fear is that I would open up and tell a story to someone who is a very bullet point by the book, like, we start a meeting, let's get down to business and get out of here. I know there's some people like that. So my fear would be, if I try to use a story, they're going to roll their eyes and go, why is this person wasting my time? And you're saying, as long as it has a point, everybody's still appreciates a good story?
Yeah, if you're in a first meeting and if the meeting isn't too big, because by convention, when someone tells a story, someone tells a story back. And that can really waste time because, you might have a tight story and then they start telling a long rambling story back. And then before you know it, you've lost the first 15 minutes of your 30-minute meeting.
Mm.
But particularly if you're one-on-one, it can be extremely powerful to tell your personal story. Now, in my personal story, I told about my wife being pregnant, 8 months pregnant. And if you put something personal like that in your personal career story, this is the story that answers, why do you do what you do? You put something personal in it, you'll very likely get something personal back from the other person. And one of the most important things to understand about storytelling is we tell stories in order to get the other person's story. This is not a one-way exercise. I'll tell my story and say, well, enough about me, Mr. CEO. What about you? How did you get to be CEO? That's pretty impressive. And then you get their story, and the way you told your story will seed the way they will tell their story back. So if you include something personal, if you include some vulnerability, like being very lucky, they'll put something in about themselves and their own vulnerability. And this is really where friendship and proper connection actually starts. We don't connect human to human with people over the presentation or the discussion of the numbers, the business case, and these things. We connect over mundane little vulnerable things that show that I'm a human like you, and I have my foibles, but you can trust me, and I'm credible. And this is incredibly important to understand, and it's understood better in a lot of the cultures that I've worked with around the world. In fact, there is no business before significant socializing in most countries in the world, actually.
How can leaders, business leaders, use this? I know you work a lot with salespeople and you do sales training, and so you're intimately aware of the challenges of training and development. A lot of people listening to this podcast work in training and development for big companies. They're helping their leaders become better leaders, right? The essence of leadership.
Correct.
And I hear a lot about, how do I get people to tell more, to get better at storytelling, to influence and get their people to do certain things? So why is this important for leaders? How do they get them to be better at storytelling?
Yeah, well, and storytelling sure is a thing these days, to the point of overuse and misunderstanding. Quite often, very often, I hear the word story, not a story. My clients I work with sales teams, Andy, but my clients are CEOs and business owners, because that's my best way to do good work, is to meet business leaders that are frustrated with the revenue generation part of their business, that they know they can do it themselves. They usually built their business to a certain point. When business leaders build to a point that they need a sales team, they're handing over what they figured out themselves somehow how to do to agents, to people who will do it for them. And it's my experience that those founder CEOs are fantastic storytellers. In fact, if they have a fault, it is that they don't stop storytelling. They hardly allow a chance for the exchange of stories. That's a really common thing, actually, with founder CEOs. They tell story after story, and their staff roll their eyes around them because they've all heard the story 100 times. But they're still fantastically persuasive. Those stories are incredibly persuasive. But the staff don't feel like they can. They know they are not the founder. They can't tell those stories. They feel they can't tell them. But that's what I do. I teach the sales team how to tell the stories like the founder can, and I do it with a method. So I teach them exactly the method. So generally, and your question was how to learn that, Andy. How do you learn that? The process of learning business storytelling, I've found, works best in groups. It works best in groups because a group within a team, there will be people that have fantastic stories. They will have experienced things in the company, so they'll have stories. So we use the group environment workshop, usually over a day. I have two types of workshops. One I call storytelling for rapport, where we really work on rapport building stories of personal story, exchanging stories, company story, and how to tell the story of someone else. Because if I tell your story, Andy, I can pump you up. I mean, I can definitely tell Andy the hero. I can't really modestly tell that about myself. I need to include the things that I've done in my career to
I love telling stories for other people on their behalf. It's one of the
it
most
is
fulfilling, wonderful things to do. I love
correct.
introducing other people and telling their stories and pumping them up, because you
That's right.
can be so boastful about other people. It's fun, right? Whereas if you do it about yourself, it's like, that guy's arrogant.
Exactly. So that's a pretty good distinction right there. But when you have that first meeting with a potential client, by by letting them know and trust the other people in your team before they even meet them, you give those people a fantastic advantage in their future conversations, and you really smooth, you're oiling the wheels of all the future engagements when you do that. So I call that the key person or key staff story. It's a really important story. And in that one-day workshop, of course, you're learning the stories of the other people in your team. So this is just a great way to get to learn those stories. The second day that we do, I call storytelling for deal making. And here we go into success stories. How do you tell the story of your successful clients from their perspective? And most people are pretty okay at telling stories about things that happen to themselves, but great storytellers can tell other people's stories and have to. You know, salespeople are agents for their company. They have to tell other people's stories. And that is a real clue to deal making. You've got to be able to tell the stories of your leaders and how they demonstrate your values, and the stories of your company insights. And you know, insight selling is one of these sort of buzzwords, you know, a bit like storytelling, and a lot of people don't really understand what an insight is, but an insight by definition is something that your market and your future client doesn't understand. They don't get it, otherwise it's not an insight. And if you can't, like, that's just sort of so obvious, right? It's not insightful if you already know it. You know, it's like, but if you can't tell the story of how you learnt that insight, if you can't teach through the story of learning the insight, then you'll just come across as someone who arrogantly thinks they know more about my business than I do. This is where you get this with this sort of concept of challenging sales. You know, it's not about challenging the client with something they don't know. It's about teaching them something that they should know. And that's done with the insight story. So the storytelling for deal making day, we go through those types of stories and we teach how to craft those stories and then how to tell them and in what context to tell them, because we want to tell the right type of story in the right context.
Mike, what are the most, in your book, you go through the 7 critical stories, important stories that salespeople need to tell. When you think about leaders in a business, corporate context, what do you think are the most important stories for them to be able to tell to influence their people?
Yeah, well, leaders, the first story that a leader has to be able to tell is the company's strategy story. So the company strategy story is, it's a history of how your company founded, why it existed, why didn't it fail, how did it succeed, why didn't it fail, and then where is it going? Where is the company going? So it's a narrative that starts in the past, and then it very often changes. So quite often companies are challenged by some new thing that's happening. So the company is challenged. And then what are the special gifts that your company has, the tools, the lightsabers, you know, if you're Luke Skywalker, the tools that you have that are going to help you win the day in your future strategy. That story is critically important. And we do a workshop program for boards and CEOs on the company strategy story. And that's a little bit different from the other storytelling sessions because it's very difficult to get a board for a whole day. So we do it in a half day, but then we do quite a bit of work afterwards, making sure that other people down through the organization can tell the company strategy story. And we do that with video messaging, actually. Video messaging is a really powerful way to practice and embed stories through an organization. So I consider the company strategy story as the linchpin, the key story of a leader. And the value stories are the stories that explain to your staff how we behave, how we will achieve our goal through which behaviors and which practices. And those values are also part of our armor. They're part of our armory in achieving the strategy. So those are the story types that the company strategy story and the values that will lead change and will inspire people to go in a direction. Because your job as a leader is to inspire people to follow you. And if you want to get someone to follow you, you absolutely have to paint the picture of where you're going.
Yeah.
And then you have to explain to them how it's possible by the special tools that you have that are going to get you there. So where you've come from, why you have to change, where you're going, and how you're going to get there is the corporate company strategy story.
Yeah, and I think when I think about my work with corporate leaders and managers, oftentimes there's a big gap that they don't really understand the company strategy. They don't do a good job of really relating that to their team, to their employees. And then people don't really know why they're being asked to do certain things. They don't understand the purpose behind it. And therefore, they're not really aligned to the overall company strategy. They're not doing their best work to contribute towards that. And that's where a lot of times great strategies fail. And I specifically say great strategies because companies can put together really wonderful strategies, but if they're not able to really communicate that effectively to their people and get their people aligned and excited about the strategy, then that strategy will fail in the execution. And one of the great ways to do that, I mean, I've done a lot of work in strategy alignment using experiential learning programs, business simulations. And part of that is giving leaders a position or place to tell the story of the strategy in a different way. And so you're saying it's really important for them to be able to talk about the company, the origins, you know, the strategy, maybe the purpose, the mission, the values, all of those things in a way that's compelling and interesting to the employees so that they are more motivated to go out and execute on that strategy.
Yeah, maybe I can give a short example.
Sure.
I'll give one from the Seven Stories book. When I and also to show that the company strategy story, it depends on what type of company you're in, how that strategy story could be. So if you're working for a startup, then the story is typically the founder's story. You know, it's how did they start and tell me about, you know, building the shed or whatever, you know, starting in the shed or, you know, sleeping on couches and this and that. And then we had this good fortune and we started the company. But if you're working for a big corporation, then the founder's story may not be that relevant, or you may be in a completely different business by now. You know, you're 10 acquisitions in, you know, the company's not like that. So you have to think of the geography you're in or the product that you're working with or that kind of thing. So for example, when I joined, when I moved to Russia in the early 2000s, and we had a new president in Russia by the name of Vladimir Putin at that time. And I had heard, so Schlumberger is an interesting company. It's a massive oil and gas services company. It's about a $40 billion per annum company these days, but it started in the 1920s, late 1920s, with two French brothers. The correct, you know, we say Schlumberger, but Schlumberger, it's an Alsatian name. It's from the French-German border. And Conrad and Marcel Schlumberger invented a technique for, they figured if they lowered an electrode in an oil well and measured the potential from that, voltage potential from that electrode on the surface, they could measure high resistivity, and that's where the oil was. So they invented a technique for knowing where the oil is in an oil well. But that's the kind of invention that makes a $40 billion company. But when they invented it, like every entrepreneur, no one wanted to listen, right? No one thought that was a good idea, except in Russia. So they had their early success in Russia, in Georgia and southern republics of Russia. They really got it. But in the 1930s, Stalin nationalized them, took all of their equipment and kicked them out of the Soviet Union. But fortunately, by that time, they'd started to get going also in Texas. And so the company has become what it is now, a massive multinational company. But when in the 1990s, when Russia was opening up again to Western companies, Schlumberger had to make a decision: do we go back into Russia or not? And the strategy guys took a business case to the CEO and essentially asked him, you know, how much money are you willing to risk? And he had a very blunt, short answer, which was $200 million. and they took the decision to invest in two of the newly privatized Russian oil companies. So you had this monolithic state oil company that was arbitrarily split up into tens of oil companies and gas companies. So they took two of those companies pretty much at random, the number 2 and the number 6 companies, and invested heavily in expertise and technology to put CFOs and people into these companies. And those two companies did the exact opposite of every other Russian oil company, which is they doubled their production in 18 months while the others were all still going down. This was a terrible time for the Russian oil industry. And I told that story I've just told you then, I told that story to several of my clients, and then I started hearing that story coming back from other clients. That's when you know you've got a good story, when you start hearing it retold by your clients. And the message in that story, you know, I mean, Schlumberger, to finish that story, that's a multi-billion-dollar industry for Schlumberger now, Schlumberger Russia and the former Soviet Union. So, you know, this is a company that lives by innovation and will make you rich. I mean, Schlumberger makes oil companies rich. That's the fact of it, right? And it's an incredibly powerful story because of the history, and it's the history in that location. So that's an example of a corporate story customized to the specific geography and the specific situation of re-entering a market.
That's great, and it's compelling and gets people to really understand the history and why they're there, and why it exists, and the ups and downs, the challenges they've been through. The last question I have for you, Mike, is for people that are talent development professionals or anyone that's looking to help their leaders get better at storytelling. What advice would you give them other than putting your book in their hands? I know you mentioned you run some workshops as well. What other things can they do to get better at using storytelling?
So storytelling is something that companies should implement as a practice. So we're great at having weekly sales meetings or weekly management meetings, and we talk about all sorts of arcane things, and people don't pay much attention in those meetings because they become easily predictable. But if you implement a story, nominate someone to tell the next meeting story, give them the job of researching a new story, and tell the story at a next meeting, and give someone else the job of telling last meeting's story, you will start to put in place a practice of storytelling in your company. And then you'll start to notice that this is a tool, that it's a skill that you can develop and really turn your company into a story company. And that's really what I'm about with my business now. I want to create story teams and story companies. And that's really about the practice of storytelling.
Got it. That's great, Mike. I agree. You know, as with any sales conversations or performance review, coaching, feedback conversations, we often don't want to practice, right? We don't have time, and we just want to do it in the moment. But there's a reason why sports teams practice over and over again. There's a reason why the military practices over and over again before they get into real combat. It's because to get good at anything that you don't do naturally, we have to practice. And so if you want to be good at storytelling, you want to be good at having sales conversations, you want to be good at having coaching conversations with your people, you need to practice. And that's a lot of what I do, is provide opportunities for people to practice. Sounds like you in your workshops give people an opportunity to practice. And so for anybody listening who wants to reach out to you, maybe find out more about the work you do, your workshops, where's the best place for them to go for that?
So I'm going to make the assumption that your listeners are functional Googlers. They could type Mike Adams storytelling. They're going to find 100 things, including different ways to consume 7 stories. So it's an audio book, and it's an ebook, and it's a softback. So that's the easiest way to find me. And maybe I could just finish and say that what selling has taught me is that you need to think about the outcome. So when I'm consulting, I'm thinking about the enduring outcome. It's not about having a fun day, but what can I leave as an enduring outcome? And I think that's the right way to think when you're a consultant. You're a guest for a short time in a company. What can I leave that endures? And I think in terms of the stories, because stories endure in people's mind.
Yeah.
But also the concept of a story library. A story library is such a powerful thing that almost no company has. Almost no company has invested in capturing the best stories in a way that people can can consume them. And the simple, easy way to store stories is as short videos, and you can capture them on an iPhone, but store them. And then when new people come into your company, they can listen to the people that didn't have the benefit of the workshop can still hear and watch those stories. And the final thing I work to do is to get at least one story leader, not the CEO, but someone to take on the role of being the custodian of the stories. And we have an extended program to coach that person. How do you facilitate a storytelling session? How do you be the person that looks after the company stories and keeps them in good shape and make sure the right people know them? That's the story leader, and that's the name of our company.
That's it right there. I like it. So go ahead and Google if you know how to do that, Mike Adams.
Yeah, if you don't know how to Google, you can't be on Andy's
That's
show.
right. You can't listen anymore. The book is called 7 Stories Every Salesperson Must Tell. I read it and enjoyed it, and I am looking to get better at storytelling myself. And so if you end up in a conversation with me, look for me to try to tell you a story. Mike, thanks so much for coming on, for getting up early in the morning and coming on at 6 a.m. in Australia to share some of your story and your advice on storytelling. I really appreciate it. And I wish you the best of luck.
Andy, absolute pleasure. Delighted.
All right, take care.